The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Nora Sullivan ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was 1878, and the small Colorado mining town was the last place she'd expected to find herself in a shootout. Nora had arrived in Willow Creek just 3 days ago, seeking refuge from a past that haunted her every waking moment. At 24, she carried more heartache than most women twice her age. Her simple blue calico dress was travel-worn, but her eyes still burned with a fierce determination that belied her fragile appearance. "Stay down, madam," a deep voice commanded as another shot rang out. Nora glanced up to see a tall figure diving behind the same trough, dust kicking up around his boots. His face was partially obscured by a worn leather hat, but she caught a glimpse of striking blue eyes and a strong jawline peppered with stubble. "I didn't plan on standing," she replied sharply, flinching as another bullet splintered the wooden building behind them. The stranger's mouth quirked into the slightest hint of a smile as he checked his revolver. "Name's Yates Morgan, and you've picked a hell of a day to be on Main Street." "Nora Sullivan, and I wasn't exactly invited to this particular event." She peered cautiously around the edge of the trough. "What is happening?" "Bank's been robbed. Those are the Decker brothers making their escape." Yates adjusted his hat and readied his weapon. "Been tracking them for 2 weeks." "You're a lawman, bounty hunter." He glanced at her briefly. "Stay here. When the shooting stops, head into the general store." Before Nora could protest, Yates had rolled away from their cover and was moving swiftly between buildings. She watched as he disappeared from view, his movements fluid and purposeful. The gunfire continued for several more minutes before an eerie silence fell over the street. Cautiously, Nora rose to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. The town seemed to collectively hold its breath as 2 men lay sprawled in the dirt road, while another was being led away by the sheriff, his hands bound behind his back. Yates stood nearby, speaking with another man wearing a badge. There was blood on his sleeve, and Nora realized with a start that he'd been hit. Without thinking, she rushed toward him. "You're injured," she said, reaching for his arm. Yates looked down at her with surprise. "It's just a graze. It needs tending." Her voice brooked no argument. Years of caring for her ailing father had taught her a thing or two about wounds. The sheriff, a grizzled man with a thick mustache, chuckled. "Better let the lady help you, Morgan. You look like you're about to fall over." Yates scowled, but didn't resist when Nora led him toward the hotel where she'd taken a room. She was aware of the curious glances from townspeople emerging from their hiding places, but she ignored them. Something about this man compelled her to help him, despite her vow to keep to herself. In her small room, Nora directed Yates to sit on the lone wooden chair while she retrieved a basin of water and the few medical supplies she traveled with. "You always rush to help strangers who could get you killed?" Yates asked as she cut away the bloodied fabric of his shirt. "Only the ones who try to protect me from flying bullets," she replied, examining the wound. It was indeed just a graze, but it needed cleaning. "This will sting." He barely flinched as she cleaned the wound with whiskey from a small flask she kept for medicinal purposes. As she worked, Nora was acutely aware of his eyes studying her face. "You're new to Willow Creek," he stated, arrived on Tuesday's stage. "Visiting family?" Nora shook her head. "No family, just passing through." "That's what I said 3 years ago." There was a note of amusement in his voice. "I don't plan on staying." She began wrapping a clean bandage around his arm. "There, that should hold." Yates flexed his arm experimentally. "You've done this before. My father was ill for many years. I learned what I needed to." Something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Nora stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable with their proximity. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan." "Mrs." she corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't when she saw the question in his eyes. "Your husband is no longer my concern," she cut him off, turning away to clean up the bloodied rags. "And I'm no longer his." Yates stood, towering over her in the small room. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm obliged for the doctoring. Perhaps I can repay you with dinner this evening." Nora stiffened. "That's not necessary. I insist. A man should repay his debts." His voice was gentle but firm. The hotel dining room at 7, against her better judgment, Nora found herself nodding. Very well, 7 o'clock. After Yates left, Nora sat heavily on the edge of her bed, wondering what she'd just agreed to. She'd come to Willow Creek to escape, to hide, to heal. Getting involved with anyone, especially a bounty hunter, was the last thing she needed. But as she washed the blood from her hands, she couldn't help but recall the intensity in those blue eyes, the quiet strength in his voice. It was just dinner, she told herself. A simple thank you for her help, nothing more. Yet something inside her, something she thought had died months ago, stirred to life. And that terrified her more than any gunfight ever could. That evening, Nora found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, and pinned her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style. As she fastened the cameo brooch at her throat, she chided herself for her foolishness. This was merely a polite dinner, not a social call. The hotel dining room was busy when she descended the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock. Yates was waiting for her near the entrance, and Nora was struck by his transformation. Gone was the dust-covered bounty hunter. In his place stood a well-groomed gentleman in a dark suit, his tawny hair neatly combed. Only the weathered tan of his face and hands betrayed his outdoor profession. "Mrs. Sullivan," he greeted her, offering his arm. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." She accepted his arm with practiced grace, though the touch sent an unexpected current through her. He led her to a corner table where a bottle of wine already waited. As they settled into their seats, Nora noticed several curious glances from other diners. News traveled fast in small towns. "I hope I haven't damaged your reputation," she said quietly as Yates poured the wine. He looked puzzled. "My reputation, being seen with a woman of uncertain standing," understanding dawned in his eyes. "In my experience, those who concern themselves with others' reputations usually have the most to hide about their own." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Nora hesitated before touching her glass to his. "Is that what this is?" "It's dinner, Mrs. Sullivan. What it becomes after that is entirely up to fate." Throughout the meal, Yates proved to be an engaging companion. He spoke of his travels across the Western Territories, of the landscapes he'd seen and the people he'd met. He was careful, Nora noticed, to avoid tales of violence or the darker aspects of his profession. In turn, she found herself sharing small, safe pieces of her past, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of literature, her brief stint as a schoolteacher. But whenever the conversation veered toward her marriage or what had brought her to Willow Creek, Nora deftly steered it elsewhere. "You're very skilled at answering questions without revealing anything of substance," Yates observed as they finished their dessert. Nora smiled thinly. "A necessary skill for a woman traveling alone. True enough." He studied her for a moment. "How long do you plan to stay in Willow Creek?" "I haven't decided." The truth was, she had nowhere specific to go. She'd been drifting westward for months, staying in towns just long enough to earn some money before moving on. "And you, will you be leaving now that you've caught your bounty?" "Not immediately. The sheriff asked me to stay on for a while. The town's growing and there's been trouble." "The kind that follows gold and silver?" Yates nodded. "The mines bring prosperity, but also those looking to take advantage, like the men today. The Deckers are small time compared to some." His expression darkened momentarily, "but yes, like them." As they finished their wine, Nora found herself reluctant for the evening to end. Yates was the first person in months who'd treated her as something other than an object of pity or suspicion. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they stood to leave. "It was unexpected." "The best things often are." He escorted her to the staircase leading to the hotel rooms. "May I call on you again, Mrs. Sullivan?" Nora should have said no. She should have explained that she wasn't staying, that she couldn't afford entanglements. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd like that." The smile that spread across his face made her heart flutter traitorously. "Good night, then." "Good night, Mr. Morgan." As Nora climbed the stairs, she felt his eyes following her. Part of her wanted to run, to pack her meager belongings and take the next stage out of town. But another part she'd thought long dead wanted to stay, to see what might develop between her and this intriguing man. In her room, Nora removed the cameo brooch and stared at the tiny photograph hidden inside the face of the man who had shattered her trust along with her heart. She snapped it closed with a decisive click. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "I won't make the same mistake twice." But even as she prepared for bed, Nora knew she was lying to herself. The wall she'd built around her heart had already begun to crumble, and the thought terrified her more than she cared to admit. The following morning, Nora woke early and dressed in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist. She had inquired about work upon her arrival and had been offered a position at the town's small library, which doubled as a reading room for the local newspaper. The pay was minimal, but the work was peaceful and required little interaction with others, exactly what she wanted. As she walked the short distance from the hotel to the library, Nora tried to push thoughts of Yates Morgan from her mind. She had allowed herself one evening of pleasant company, but now it was time to return to reality. She was a woman with secrets, a woman on the run, and she couldn't afford to form attachments. The library was quiet when she arrived, the musty scent of old books filling the air. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman who managed the establishment, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan. I've left a stack of new acquisitions on the desk that need cataloging, and Mr. Finch dropped off the latest edition of the newspaper for binding." "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. I'll see to it right away." The older woman hesitated, a knowing gleam in her eye. "I heard you had dinner with Mr. Morgan last evening." Nora fought to keep her expression neutral. "Yes, he was thanking me for tending a minor injury." Mrs. Abernathy smiled. "He's a good man, despite his profession. Not one for settling down, mind you, but respected nonetheless." "It was just dinner," Nora said firmly, turning to the stack of books. "Of course, dear." As the morning progressed, Nora lost herself in the methodical work of cataloging and shelving. The library received few visitors, a blessing as far as she was concerned. But shortly before noon, the bell above the door jingled and she looked up to find Yates standing in the entryway, hat in hand. "Mr. Morgan," she said, surprised. "How did you know where to find me, small town?" he replied with a slight smile. "Everyone knows everything." Nora set down the book she'd been examining. "Did you need something? I thought you might like to join me for lunch." He glanced around the empty library. "Unless you're too busy." Mrs. Abernathy, who had materialized from the back room with suspicious promptness, waved a hand. "Go on, Mrs. Sullivan. It's as quiet as a church on Monday. I can manage." Finding herself cornered, Nora reluctantly agreed. She gathered her shawl and followed Yates into the bright midday sun. "You didn't have to come find me," she said as they walked toward a small cafe on the corner. "I wanted to." He offered his arm, which she took after a moment's hesitation. "Besides, I need to ask a favor." "A favor?" Nora raised an eyebrow. "We've barely met, Mr. Morgan. Yates, please, and it's nothing untoward." They reached the cafe and he held the door for her. "I need someone who can read and write a fine hand." Inside, they chose a table near the window. The cafe was simple but clean, with checkered cloths on the tables and the aroma of fresh bread in the air. "Why do you need someone with good penmanship?" Nora asked after they'd ordered. "The sheriff received some documents about a land dispute. The handwriting is challenging. I thought perhaps you might help decipher it." "And why would you think I could do that? You work in a library, and your bandaging technique suggested educated hands." His blue eyes held a hint of amusement. "Am I wrong?" Nora sighed. "No, I taught school for several years. I'm accustomed to deciphering poor handwriting." "Then you'll help." She should have refused. Getting involved with anything related to law enforcement was risky. But the earnestness in Yates's expression weakened her resolve. "I suppose I could look at the documents. Thank you." His smile was warm enough to melt the last of her resistance. "After lunch, I'll take you to the sheriff's office." Their meal arrived, simple fare of beef stew and fresh bread, and they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Nora found herself studying Yates surreptitiously. In daylight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight silvering at his temples. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. "How long have you been a bounty hunter?" she asked. "About 8 years." He tore a piece of bread thoughtfully. "Before that, I rode with the cavalry, and before that, I was a ranch hand in Texas." a varied life. And yours, his gaze was direct. Before you became a wandering librarian, Nora tensed. I told you I was a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania, yes, and then life changed. She set down her spoon, appetite fading. Mr. Morgan Yates, I appreciate your interest, but my past is my own. He nodded slowly. Fair enough, we all have things we'd rather not discuss. The remainder of lunch passed with safer topics of conversation, the town's history, the books Nora was cataloging, Yates's observations on the changing Western territories. By the time they finished, Nora had relaxed again, even laughing at his droll description of a disastrous cattle drive years earlier. True to his word, Yates escorted her to the sheriff's office after lunch. The small wooden building smelled of tobacco and gun oil, with wanted posters lining the walls. Sheriff Hollister, the same man Nora had seen after the shooting, looked up from his desk with surprise. Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it? What brings you here? I asked the lady to help with those land documents, Jim, Yates explained. She has experience with such things. The sheriff looked skeptical but pushed a stack of papers across the desk. If you can make heads or tails of these, madam, I'd be mighty grateful. Nora took a seat and began examining the documents. They detailed a dispute over water rights between a ranch and the mining company, with handwritten testimonies from various witnesses. The penmanship was indeed atrocious, but after years of deciphering children's scrawls, Nora had little difficulty. For the next hour, she carefully read through each page, occasionally asking questions for clarification. Yates and the sheriff discussed other matters nearby, but she was aware of Yates's frequent glances in her direction. Finally, she set down the last page. From what I can determine, the Coldwater Ranch has the prior claim to the stream according to territorial law. The mining company's documentation appears to have been altered. See how the date is written over an erasure. The sheriff leaned closer, squinting at where she pointed. I'll be damned. You've got sharp eyes, Mrs. Sullivan. She has many talents, Yates said quietly. Nora felt a flush creep up her neck at his tone. Will that be all, Sheriff? I should return to the library. Yes, madam, and thank you. Sheriff Hollister tipped his hat. This will save a lot of trouble. Outside, the afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows down the street. Yates fell into step beside Nora as she headed back toward the library. That was impressive, he said. You've just prevented what could have been a violent confrontation. I merely read what was written and saw what others missed. He touched her arm lightly, stopping her. Nora, may I call you Nora? You have a gift for seeing truth. She withdrew her arm, uncomfortable with his perception. Not always. Something in her tone must have alerted him, for he didn't press further. Instead, he simply said, "Let me walk you back." They continued in silence, the busy afternoon activities of the town swirling around them. At the library door, Nora turned to thank him for lunch, but the words died in her throat when she saw his expression intent, searching as though trying to solve a puzzle. "What is it?" she asked, unnerved. "I'm trying to understand you," he admitted. "Why a woman like you would be hiding in a place like this?" "I'm not hiding," she protested too quickly. "Aren't you?" His voice was gentle, not accusatory. "Everyone in Willow Creek is hiding from something, Nora. It's that kind of town." Before she could respond, he took her hand and pressed it briefly. "Thank you for your help today, and for the company." Then he was gone, striding down the street with that same purposeful gait she'd noticed during the shootout. Nora watched him go, a mixture of relief and regret washing over her. Mrs. Abernathy appeared beside her. My, he certainly seems taken with you." "He's merely being polite," Nora replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. "If you say so, dear." The older woman patted her arm. "But a word of advice from someone who's seen many come and go through this town. Not all men are the same." Nora turned sharply. "I never suggested they were. You didn't have to." Mrs. Abernathy's kind eyes held understanding. "It's written all over you, the way you hold yourself apart, the wariness when a man pays attention. Someone hurt you badly." "Mrs. Abernathy, I'm not prying," the librarian assured her. "Just observing that Mr. Morgan isn't like most men who pass through here. He has honor." With that, she disappeared back into the library, leaving Nora standing in the doorway, her thoughts in turmoil. It was dangerous, this connection forming between her and Yates. dangerous because it made her want things she couldn't have: stability, trust, perhaps even love again. And those were luxuries Nora Sullivan could no longer afford. The next few days passed quietly. Nora threw herself into her work at the library, staying late to organize shelves and repair damaged books. She told herself she was being diligent, but in truth, she was avoiding the possibility of running into Yates again. Her efforts were in vain. On Friday afternoon, as she was shelving a collection of poetry, the library door opened and Yates entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He was dressed for riding, with dust on his boots and a determined set to his jaw. "You've been avoiding me," he said without preamble. Nora carefully placed the book she was holding onto the shelf. "I've been working. For 3 days straight, according to Mrs. Abernathy." "You've been asking about me." She turned to face him, irritation flaring. "Why? Because I enjoy your company." He stepped closer. "And I think, despite your best efforts to deny it, you enjoy mine as well." Nora crossed her arms defensively. "Mr. Morgan, Yates." "Fine, Yates. I appreciate your interest, but I'm not looking for entanglements of any kind." "Who said anything about entanglements?" His eyes held a challenge. "I'm inviting you to a social gathering, not proposing marriage." "A social gathering?" "The town is holding a dance tomorrow evening to celebrate Founders' Day. I'd like you to accompany me." Nora hesitated. A public event would be safer than another private dinner, and a small, traitorous part of her did want to see him again. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said, a weak excuse even to her own ears. Yates smiled, sensing victory. "I'm sure Mrs. Abernathy could help with that. So is that a yes?" "It's a perhaps." Nora returned to her shelving, trying to appear nonchalant. "I'll need to consider it. I'll call for you at 7 tomorrow evening." He placed his hat back on his head. "Unless I hear otherwise." After he left, Nora leaned against the bookshelf, her heart racing. This was foolishness. She should pack her bags and leave on tomorrow's stage. Yet the thought of dancing with Yates, of spending another evening in his company, filled her with a longing she couldn't easily dismiss. Mrs. Abernathy, who had witnessed the exchange from behind her desk, cleared her throat. "I have a blue silk that would suit you beautifully," she said. "My daughter left it behind when she moved to Denver, never wore it more than once." Nora looked at the older woman's knowing smile and sighed in defeat. "I haven't agreed to go." "Of course not, dear, but should you decide to, the dress is yours to borrow." By the time Nora returned to her hotel room that evening, she had all but convinced herself to decline Yates's invitation. She had even composed a polite note of refusal in her head. But when she entered her room and saw her reflection in the small mirror, the shadows under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth, she felt a sudden rebellion against the fear that had dictated her life for too long. One dance. What harm could come from one dance? The following evening, Nora stood before the mirror in Mrs. Abernathy's blue silk dress, hardly recognizing herself. The gown was slightly outdated in style but beautifully made, with delicate lace at the bodice and a fuller skirt than was currently fashionable. Mrs. Abernathy had insisted on arranging her hair as well, pinning the auburn waves into an elegant coiffure adorned with a borrowed pearl comb. "There," the older woman said, stepping back to admire her work. "Mr. Morgan won't know what hit him." "It's just a dance," Nora protested weakly. Mrs. Abernathy merely smiled. "It's never just a dance, my dear." A knock at the door announced Yates's arrival. Nora's stomach fluttered nervously as Mrs. Abernathy went to answer it. She heard their voices in the hallway, his deep and measured, the librarian's animated and pleased. Then he was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, and Nora forgot to breathe. Yates was resplendent in a dark suit, his usually untamed hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was the look in his eyes as he beheld her that made her pulse quicken. Appreciation, yes, but something deeper, more profound. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you." She smoothed the silk skirt, suddenly shy. "Mrs. Abernathy was kind enough to lend me the dress." "The dress is lovely, but it's the woman wearing it that takes my breath away." Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat. "You two had best be going. The dance will be starting soon." Yates offered his arm, and Nora took it, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her. As they stepped out into the evening air, She felt as though she were stepping into another life, one where she wasn't running, where she could simply be a woman enjoying the company of a man who made her heart race. The town hall had been transformed for the celebration. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople. A small band played in the corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined one wall. As Yates led her into the room, Nora felt the curious stares of the other attendees. She was still a newcomer, and appearing on the arm of the town's resident bounty hunter was certain to fuel gossip. "Everyone's looking," she murmured. "Let them look." Yates's hand pressed reassuringly against the small of her back. "They're just jealous. I've secured the company of the most beautiful woman in the room." The warmth of his words chased away her discomfort. Yates introduced her to several people: the mayor and his wife, the owner of the general store, a young doctor recently arrived from St. Louis. Nora found herself relaxing as the evening progressed, even laughing at the mayor's exaggerated tales of the town's founding. When the band struck up a waltz, Yates turned to her with a question in his eyes. Nora hesitated only briefly before nodding. He led her to the dance floor, one hand taking hers, the other settling at her waist. "I should warn you," she said as they began to move. "It's been some time since I've danced. You're doing fine." His hand was warm through the silk of her dress. "Just follow my lead." And she did, surrendering to the music and the steady guidance of his arms. They moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before, Nora's skirts swirling around them as Yates led her through the steps with surprising grace for such a formidable man. "Where did a bounty hunter learn to waltz?" she asked, breathless from the dance and his proximity. "My mother insisted all her sons learn proper social graces." A smile touched his lips. "Said we'd never find decent wives otherwise. And did your brothers also master the waltz?" Nathan did. Youngest always was mother's favorite. His expression softened at the memory. "Noah preferred riding to dancing, never did see the point of it. And yet here you are dancing. Here I am." His eyes held hers, and for a moment the room around them faded away. "With you." The music ended, breaking the spell. Nora stepped back, flustered by the intensity of the moment. "I should like some punch," she said, needing distance to compose herself. Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll fetch some for both of us." As he moved toward the refreshment table, Nora found a quiet corner to catch her breath. She watched Yates navigate through the crowd, stopping to exchange words with the sheriff. There was an easy confidence in his bearing, a natural authority that drew others to him. "He's quite the man, isn't he?" Nora turned to find a woman beside her, perhaps 40, elegantly dressed, with sharp features and assessing eyes. "I beg your pardon, Yates Morgan." The woman extended a gloved hand. "I'm Victoria Hargrove. My husband owns the Silver Spire mine." Nora shook the offered hand. "Nora Sullivan." "Yes, I know, the mysterious widow working at our little library." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yates has been quite taken with you." Something in the woman's tone put Nora on alert. "We're merely acquaintances, of course." Victoria glanced toward where Yates stood talking with the sheriff. "I should warn you, though, Yates isn't the settling type. He's charmed many a lady in this town, only to ride off when the next bounty calls." Nora stiffened. "As I said, we're only acquaintances." "How fortunate, then, that your heart isn't engaged." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "It would be a shame to see it broken. Again." Before Nora could respond, Yates returned with 2 cups of punch. Victoria's demeanor changed instantly, her voice warming. "Yates, darling. It's been too long since you've joined us for dinner, Mrs. Hargrove." His greeting was polite but cool. "I trust your husband is well, thriving, as always. Do bring Mrs. Sullivan to dine with us soon." With a final meaningful glance at Nora, Victoria glided away. What did she want? Yates asked, handing Nora a cup. "To warn me about you, I believe." Nora sipped the sweet punch, studying him over the rim. "She implied you have a habit of charming women and then leaving." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Victoria Hargrove enjoys stirring trouble, her husband more so." "Is it true?" Yates met her gaze directly. "I've never made promises I couldn't keep, Nora, and I've never intentionally hurt anyone. But you do leave." "My job requires it, yes." He set down his untouched punch. "Would you like to go outside? It's getting warm in here." Nora recognized the deflection but agreed nonetheless. They slipped out a side door into a small garden behind the town hall. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stuffiness of the dance, the sky ablaze with stars. "It's beautiful," Nora said, looking up at the vast expanse above them. "One thing I love about the West you can see forever on a clear night." Yates stood close beside her, his voice soft in the darkness. "Makes a man feel small and significant all at once." They were silent for a moment, both contemplating the heavens. Then Yates spoke again, his tone more serious. "What Victoria said about my leaving, it's true that I haven't stayed in one place long. The nature of what I do makes putting down roots complicated." "I understand that better than most," Nora admitted. "Do you?" He turned to face her, his features half shadowed in the dim light spilling from the hall windows. "Then maybe you'll understand this too. Since meeting you, I've been thinking that maybe some roots wouldn't be so bad." Nora's heart stuttered. "Yates, I'm not declaring anything," he assured her quickly. "Just sharing a thought, a possibility. Possibilities can be dangerous, so can running forever." The words struck too close to home. Nora turned away, wrapping her arms around herself despite the mild evening. "You don't know what I'm running from," she said quietly. "No, I don't." He moved to stand before her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "But I'd like to, if you'd trust me enough to tell me." Trust. Such a simple word for such a difficult concept. Nora had trusted before and been betrayed in the worst possible way. Could she risk it again, looking up into Yates's face, open, earnest, patient? She found herself wanting to. Not everything, perhaps, not yet, but something. "I was married," she began haltingly. "In Pennsylvania. His name was Thomas Sullivan." Yates remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "He was the bank manager in our town, respected, admired." The bitter taste of memory filled her mouth. "We were married for 5 years. What happened?" Nora drew a deep breath. "He embezzled money from the bank, used my family name. My father had been a founder of the institution to cover his actions. When it was discovered, She faltered. "He blamed you," Yates surmised, anger edging his voice. "Not at first." "At first he begged forgiveness, swore he'd make it right." The night around them seemed to darken with her words. "But when the authorities came, he told them I had been complicit, that I had orchestrated the whole scheme." "But you hadn't." "Of course not." The vehemence in her voice surprised even her. "I knew nothing of his dealings, but there was a note, a withdrawal slip with my signature. He had forged it, but it was convincing." Yates's expression hardened. "Was he arrested?" "Yes, and so was I, briefly." The shame of that memory still burned. "My father's old friend was the judge. He believed in my innocence and released me, but Thomas." She shook her head. "Thomas was convicted. He received 10 years in prison. And you left." The scandal was unbearable. People I'd known my whole life looked at me with suspicion, with pity. "No one would hire me to teach their children." Nora's voice dropped to a whisper. "And Thomas swore that, when he was released, he would find me, that I would pay for not standing by him." Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes. "So you keep moving. 3 years now." Nora gave a small, bitter laugh. "Always looking over my shoulder." "Nora." Yates reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "He's in prison. He can't hurt you, for now, but prison terms end, and Thomas was persistent when crossed. So you'll spend your life running." There was no judgment in his question, only concern. "What choice do I have?" Before he could answer, the door to the hall opened, spilling light and music into the garden. A young man peered out, spotted them, and called, "Mr. Morgan, sheriff needs you right away." Yates squeezed Nora's hand. "Wait here, I'll be right back." He strode quickly to the door, exchanged words with the messenger, then disappeared inside. Nora remained in the garden, her confession leaving her feeling oddly lighter yet more vulnerable. She had never told anyone the full story before, and sharing it with Yates felt both terrifying and liberating. Several minutes passed before Yates returned, his expression grim. "What is it?" Nora asked, alarmed by the change in him. "Trouble at the Silver Dollar. A man was shot." He took her arm. "I need to get you back to your hotel." "The Silver Dollar, that's the saloon at the end of town." Yates nodded, already guiding her toward the street. "Sheriff says it was a dispute over cards, but given what happened earlier this week with the Deckers, he's concerned there might be more to it." They walked quickly through the town, the festive sounds of the dance fading behind them. The streets were mostly empty, with most of the town's inhabitants still at the celebration. "Will you be safe?" Nora asked as they reached the hotel. Yates's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Worried about me, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Perhaps." She met his gaze steadily. "After all, I've invested time in tending your wounds. I'd hate to see my efforts wasted." His expression softened. "I'll be careful." He hesitated, then added, "About what you told me, not now," Nora interrupted. "You need to go. We'll talk tomorrow." She nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Had she revealed too much? Would he now see her differently, as damaged, as a liability? Yates seemed to read her thoughts. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you for trusting me," he said softly. "Sleep well, Nora." Then he was gone, striding purposefully toward the far end of town where the saloon's lights blazed in the darkness. Nora watched until he disappeared from view, then entered the hotel, her mind a whirl of emotion. The desk clerk looked up as she passed, eyes widening at her finery. "Even in, Mrs. Sullivan, enjoy the dance." "Yes, thank you," she paused. "Is there trouble at the Silver Dollar?" "Heard there was a shooting," the clerk confirmed. "Sheriff and Mr. Morgan will sort it out, though." "They always do." Nora nodded and continued up the stairs, the borrowed silk rustling with each step. In her room, she carefully removed the beautiful dress and hung it up, then sat at the small vanity to unpin her hair. As the auburn waves fell around her shoulders, Nora studied her reflection. The woman who gazed back at her seemed different, somehow less haunted, perhaps. Sharing her burden with Yates had changed something within her. For the first time in 3 years, Nora went to sleep without checking that her small travel bag was packed and ready for a hasty departure. It was a tiny act of faith, but significant nonetheless. She dreamed that night of dancing under stars, of strong arms holding her close, of a deep voice promising safety. And for once, the nightmares of her past did not intrude. The next morning, Nora woke to the sounds of raised voices in the street below her window. Throwing a shawl over her nightdress, she peered outside to see a crowd gathered near the sheriff's office. Curiosity overcoming propriety, she dressed quickly and hurried downstairs. The hotel lobby was abuzz with gossip. Nora caught fragments as she passed through. "Shot dead. Caught him red-handed. Hanging's too good for him." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Nora made her way to the edge, trying to see what was happening. A woman beside her, the baker's wife, noticed her confusion. "It's that gambler from the Silver Dollar," she explained eagerly. "Sheriff caught him trying to flee town this morning. Turns out he wasn't just a card cheat, he was working with the Decker gang, the men from the bank robbery." Nora asked, "The very same." Sheriff found stolen bank notes in his room, along with a map marking the next target. The woman's eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. "Mr. Morgan's bringing him out now for transport to the territorial prison." As if on cue, the door to the sheriff's office opened. Sheriff Hollister emerged first, followed by Yates escorting a handcuffed man. The prisoner was thin and wiry, with a sharp face and cold eyes. He scanned the hostile crowd with contempt, his gaze passing over Nora without interest. Until suddenly it didn't. The man's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with malicious glee. "Well, look who it is," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The respectable Mrs. Sullivan." Nora froze as all eyes turned toward her. Yates's head snapped up, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he saw her pale face. "Don't tell me you're hiding out here too, Nora," the prisoner continued, malevolent amusement in his voice. "Thomas will be so interested to know." Terror gripped Nora's heart. James Fletcher. Her husband's closest friend and accomplice in the embezzlement scheme. The man who had testified against Thomas but managed to avoid prosecution himself due to lack of evidence. "You know this man, Mrs. Sullivan?" Sheriff Hollister asked, frowning. Before Nora could respond, Fletcher laughed. "Oh, we're old friends, aren't we, Nora? Your husband and I used to play cards every Saturday night. How is dear Thomas? Still enjoying his accommodations at the state's expense?" the crowd murmured, turning curious and suspicious eyes toward Nora. She felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, of judgment descending. It was Pennsylvania all over again. "That's enough." Yates said sharply, giving Fletcher a none too gentle shove toward the waiting wagon. Keep moving, but the damage was done. Nora could feel the weight of the townspeople's stares, hear the whispered questions. Her carefully constructed new beginning in Willow Creek was unraveling before her eyes. She turned and pushed her way back through the crowd, desperate to escape. Behind her, she heard Yates call her name, but she didn't stop. Her only thought was to get to her room to pack her few belongings, to flee before the whispers became accusations. In her room, Nora moved with frantic efficiency, throwing clothes into her travel bag, hands trembling. This was why she never stayed too long in one place, why she never allowed herself to form attachments. The past always caught up. A knock at her door startled her. "Go away," she called, continuing to pack. "Nora, it's me." Yates's voice was low, urgent. "Please let me in. I can't talk now." "Nora." There was a note in his voice she hadn't heard before, a plea. "Don't run, not yet, not without hearing me out." She hesitated, one hand on the clasp of her bag. Slowly, she crossed to the door and opened it. Yates stood in the hallway, hat in hand, concern etched in every line of his face. "May I come in?" Nora stepped aside silently, allowing him to enter. He took in the half-packed bag on the bed with a frown. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question, but Nora answered anyway. "I have to. Because of Fletcher." Yates shook his head. "He's on his way to the territorial prison." "He can't hurt you. It's not him I'm worried about." Nora resumed her packing, unable to meet Yates's eyes. "It's what he represents, what he knows. You told me about your husband last night, about the embezzlement. I didn't tell you everything." She folded a shirtwaist with shaking hands. Fletcher was involved. He was the one who helped Thomas hide the money, who taught him how to forge signatures. But when they were caught, he turned on Thomas to save himself. And now he's recognized you, and announced my presence to the entire town. Nora closed her eyes briefly, fighting back tears of frustration. By noon, everyone will know that the quiet librarian is the wife of a convicted felon. By evening, they'll be wondering if I was complicit after all. You're assuming the worst of people. I'm being realistic. She turned to face him fully. "I've lived this before, Yates. The suspicion, the whispers, the closed doors. I won't go through it again." Yates stepped closer, his expression intense. "What if you didn't have to face it alone this time?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Nora felt a dangerous hope stir within her, quickly crushed by bitter experience. "It doesn't work that way," she said softly. "People will talk. They'll start to wonder about you too, why you'd associate with someone like me. Your reputation, hang my reputation." He took another step closer. "Nora, in the short time I've known you, I've seen your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. I don't give a damn what Fletcher or anyone else says about your past. You should." She turned away, resuming her packing. "You're respected here. You can't afford to be connected to scandal. That's not your decision to make." There was a firmness in his tone that made her look up. "I choose who I stand beside, Nora, and I'm choosing to stand beside you." The declaration stole her breath. No one had stood with her when Thomas was arrested, not family, not friends. Everyone had distanced themselves, eager to avoid the taint of scandal. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk it?" Yates moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a skittish horse. "Because from the moment you tended my wound, I knew you were someone worth knowing, worth caring for." His voice dropped lower. "Maybe even worth loving, given time." Nora's heart hammered in her chest. "You can't mean that. You barely know me." "I know enough." He reached for her hand, giving her plenty of time to pull away. She didn't. "I know you've been hurt, I know you're afraid, and I know you're tired of running." "Yates, let me help you stop running, Nora." His fingers twined with hers, warm and steady. "Let me help you stand and face whatever comes, together." The offer was everything she'd secretly longed for: support, understanding, partnership, but fear still gripped her heart. "And if it becomes too much," she asked, "if the town turns against both of us? If Thomas is released and comes looking for me," a steely determination entered Yates's eyes. "Then we'll face that too. I'm not easily intimidated, Nora, and I don't abandon those I care about." Something in his expression, in the unwavering conviction of his words, broke through the last of Nora's defenses. She had been alone for so long, carrying her burden in solitary silence. The prospect of sharing it, of having someone to lean on, to trust, was overwhelming. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I know. He lifted his free hand to her cheek, his touch gentle. But you're also brave, braver than you give yourself credit for. A tear slipped down Nora's cheek. I don't feel brave. You survived betrayal. You rebuilt your life from nothing. You faced down gunfire and town gossips with equal composure. His thumb brushed away the tear. That's the definition of courage, Nora. She closed her eyes, leaning slightly into his touch. If I stay, I can't promise I won't still want to run. I'm not asking for promises, just a chance. He smiled slightly. One day at a time. Nora opened her eyes, studying his face, the sincerity in his blue eyes, the determined set of his jaw, the gentleness in his touch. In that moment, she made her decision. One day, she agreed softly. Relief and joy spread across Yates's features. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Nora stiffened momentarily, then relaxed against him, allowing herself to accept the comfort he offered. Thank you, he murmured against her hair. They stood like that for several moments, the simple human connection more healing than Nora had expected. When they finally separated, she felt steadier, more grounded than she had in years. What happens now? She asked. Now, Yates said, we face the town together. Starting with breakfast at the cafe, Nora's eyes widened. You want to go out, after what just happened, especially after what just happened. His expression was resolute. If we hide away, it only gives credence to any suspicions. Better to face it head-on, show them there's nothing to hide. I'm not sure I can. You can. He offered his arm. I'll be right beside you. Taking a deep breath, Nora placed her hand on his arm. All right. The walk to the cafe was the longest of Nora's life. Every face they passed seemed to turn toward them. Every whispered conversation felt directed at her. But Yates's steady presence beside her gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The cafe fell momentarily silent when they entered, then resumed its normal breakfast bustle with an undercurrent of murmured conversation. Yates led her to a table by the window, pulling out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy. As they settled in, the owner's wife approached with coffee pot in hand. Good morning, Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Sullivan. Her tone was pleasant, but her eyes were curious. The usual for you both, please, Mrs. Jenkins, Yates replied easily. And perhaps some of your excellent apple preserves if you have them. Just made a fresh batch yesterday. The woman poured their coffee, then hesitated. I heard there was some excitement this morning. A criminal being transported to the territorial prison, Yates confirmed, his tone matter of fact. Nothing for the town to worry about. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, but her gaze lingered on Nora. He seemed to know you, Mrs. Sullivan. Nora's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Yates shifted slightly closer to her, his support silent but unmistakable. An unfortunate acquaintance from my past, Nora said, surprised at the steadiness of her voice. From before my husband's passing. It wasn't entirely a lie. Thomas was dead to her in all ways that mattered. I see, Mrs. Jenkins seemed to weigh her words. Well, we all have people we'd rather forget, don't we? I'll get your breakfast started. As she bustled away, Nora released the breath she'd been holding. That wasn't as terrible as I expected. Most people are more decent than we give them credit for. Yates sipped his coffee. And those who aren't, he shrugged, their opinions aren't worth losing sleep over. Throughout breakfast, several townspeople stopped by their table, some with transparent curiosity, others with genuine friendliness. Nora found herself relaxing incrementally as each interaction passed without hostility or accusation. By the time they finished eating, the initial tension had largely dissipated. Outside the cafe, Yates turned to her with a smile. See, the world didn't end. No, it didn't. Nora felt a cautious optimism stirring within her. Though the day is still young, indeed it is. He glanced toward the library. Will you still work today? She hesitated, then nodded. I think so. Mrs. Abernathy is expecting me. Then I'll walk you there. He offered his arm again. And perhaps I could escort you to dinner this evening. Are you planning to be at my side for every public appearance? There was a note of teasing in her voice that surprised even her. If necessary, he replied with mock seriousness. Though I confess, I'd escort you regardless of circumstances. At the library door, Yates paused. I need to speak with the sheriff about Fletcher's transport, but I'll return later. I'll be here. The words were simple, but represented a significant commitment for Nora, a promise to stay, to stop running, at least for now. Yates's smile warmed his entire face. Until later, then. He tipped his hat and walked away, his stride confident and purposeful. Nora watched him go, a strange mixture of apprehension and hope filling her heart. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy looked up from her desk with obvious relief. "You came? I was worried after that dreadful scene this morning that you might." She trailed off delicately. "Leave." Nora hung up her shawl. "I considered it. But you didn't." The older woman beamed. "I'm glad, and I suspect Mr. Morgan had something to do with your decision. He was persuasive. I imagine he was." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled knowingly. "He's quite taken with you, you know." Nora busied herself with straightening a stack of periodicals. "It's complicated. Love usually is, my dear." The librarian patted her hand. "But that's what makes it worth the effort." The rest of the day passed in relative calm. A few library patrons regarded Nora with undisguised curiosity, but most were either unaware of the morning's events or too polite to mention them. By closing time, Nora felt cautiously optimistic that perhaps, just perhaps, her past wouldn't define her future in Willow Creek. True to his word, Yates returned to escort her to dinner. They dined at a small restaurant near the edge of town, where the food was simple but excellent and the atmosphere private enough for conversation. "Fletcher's gone," Yates informed her as they ate. "Sheriff put him on the afternoon stage with 2 deputies as escorts. He won't be troubling you again." "Until he writes to Thomas," Nora said quietly. "He'll tell him where I am." Yates reached across the table to take her hand. "When is your husband's release date?" "Not for another 7 years." She met his gaze steadily. "But that doesn't mean he can't cause trouble from inside prison walls. Then we'll be prepared." He squeezed her hand. "I won't let him hurt you, Nora." The conviction in his voice was like a balm to her wounded spirit. For the first time since Thomas's betrayal, Nora allowed herself to believe that perhaps she wasn't alone in her fight. The following weeks settled into a gentle rhythm. Nora continued her work at the library, gradually winning over even the most suspicious townspeople with her quiet competence and kindness. Yates divided his time between assisting the sheriff and pursuing his own bounties, though he noticeably took only cases that allowed him to return to Willow Creek within a few days. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. They took meals together, walked along the creek that gave the town its name, spent evenings reading by the fire in the hotel's small sitting room. Yates was patient, never pushing for more than Nora was ready to give, content to build trust slowly. One evening in late October, as they strolled back to the hotel after dinner, Yates broached a subject they'd been circling for weeks. "Winter's coming," he said, glancing at the mountains where the first dusting of snow had already appeared. "The hotel rates will go up once the traveling season ends." "Yes, Mrs. Jenkins mentioned that." Nora pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I've been setting aside some of my wages to cover the difference." Yates hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I've been thinking about that." "About your situation." "Oh," Nora looked up at him, curious. "I bought a house," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "On the north edge of town. Nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, small yard. Been fixing it up these past few weeks." Nora stopped walking, surprised by this revelation. "You bought a house, you never mentioned. I wanted it to be ready first." He turned to face her, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Nora, I'd like you to consider living there with me." Her eyes widened. "Yates, not as." "That is, I'm not suggesting." He took a breath, collecting himself. "There are 2 bedrooms. You'd have your privacy, your own space. I just thought it might be more comfortable than the hotel, more secure." "You want me to live with you," Nora repeated, trying to process the offer, "as my guest." "My friend." His eyes held hers intently. "Perhaps in time as more, but only if and when you're ready." The proposal was unexpected, unconventional, and entirely like Yates, practical yet deeply caring. Nora considered it carefully, weighing the propriety against the genuine safety and comfort it would provide. "People would talk," she said finally. "People already talk." He smiled slightly. "Does it matter so much what they say if we know the truth, did it?" Nora had spent 3 years allowing others' opinions to drive her from town to town. The prospect of defying convention, of staying despite gossip, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I would pay my share, she said, making her decision. Rent, expenses. Relief flooded Yates's face. If that makes you comfortable, though it's unnecessary. It does. Nora resumed walking, her mind racing ahead. When could I see this house? Now, if you like, it's not far. The house was indeed modest, a simple wooden structure with a small porch and sturdy roof. Inside, Nora found plain but quality furnishings, clean lines, and practical arrangements. Yates had clearly put thought into making it comfortable without being ostentatious. This would be your room, he said, showing her a pleasant space with a bed, dresser, and small writing desk near the window. I had Mrs. Abernathy help choose the bedding. She said you admired the quilt in her guest room. Nora touched the blue and white quilt, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness. It's lovely. They continued the tour of the kitchen with its new cook stove, the sitting room with bookshelves already half filled, the small garden out back where Yates confessed he hoped to grow vegetables come spring. What do you think? He asked when they returned to the front porch. Could you be comfortable here? Nora looked at the house, then at the man beside her, steady, patient, kind, a man who had stood by her when others would have walked away, who offered security without demanding surrender. Yes, she said softly. I think I could. The smile that lit Yates's face was worth any risk her decision entailed. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar yet still sent warmth coursing through her. When would you like to move in? Is Sunday too soon? Nora surprised herself with her eagerness. The library's closed and I don't have many belongings to pack. Sunday is perfect. He still held her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Nora, I want you to know I meant what I said, no expectations, no pressure. I know. And she did. In the weeks she'd known him, Yates had never given her reason to doubt his word or his intentions. Thank you. They stood on the porch a moment longer, the night air cool around them, the stars bright overhead. Something was changing between them, had been changing since that first meeting behind the water trough. Nora wasn't ready to name it yet, but she no longer feared it as she once had. Sunday arrived clear and cold. Nora packed her few possessions while Mrs. Jenkins fussed about, alternating between expressions of dismay at Nora's departure and sly comments about the unconventional arrangement. It's perfectly respectable, Nora assured her for the third time. Mr. Morgan is merely offering me more comfortable accommodations for the winter months. Of course, dear, Mrs. Jenkins winked conspiratorially, and I'm sure the separate bedrooms will remain so indefinitely. Nora felt her cheeks warm but didn't dignify the insinuation with a response. Let people think what they would. She knew the truth of the arrangement, as did Yates. He arrived precisely at noon, as promised, to transport her trunk and boxes. Together, they carried her belongings to the waiting wagon, then made the short journey to what would now be their shared home. Settling in was a simple affair, given Nora's minimal possessions. By late afternoon, her clothes hung in the wardrobe, her books lined the shelf beside her bed, and her mother's silver hairbrush set adorned the dresser top. It feels like home already, she admitted, joining Yates in the kitchen where he was preparing a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. I'm glad. He stirred the pot, the domestic scene so at odds with his usual image as the town's formidable bounty hunter that Nora couldn't help but smile. What's amusing you? Just thinking how few people would believe the sight of you cooking supper. I've been fending for myself a long time. He tasted the stew, then added a pinch of salt. Though I'll admit, it's nicer cooking for two. They ate at the small kitchen table, the meal made special by the circumstances rather than the food itself. Afterward, they sat in the sitting room, reading companionably before the fire. The normalcy of it all, the simple comfort of shared space and quiet company, brought a peace Nora hadn't experienced in years. That night, as she prepared for bed in her new room, Nora reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been planning her next escape, certain that safety lay in constant movement. Now she was putting down tentative roots in a small town with a man who had somehow breached the walls around her heart, It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, perhaps, the bravest thing she'd ever done. The following weeks brought adjustment and discovery as Nora and Yates established the rhythms of their shared life. They developed morning routines, Yates rising first to start the coffee, Nora preparing breakfast before they both left for their respective responsibilities. Evenings were spent in quiet companionship, sometimes with conversation, often in comfortable silence. December arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed Willow Creek in pristine white. The town transformed into a winter wonderland, with pine boughs and holly decorating storefronts in anticipation of Christmas. "The town looks beautiful," Nora remarked one evening as they walked home from a community gathering at the church. "I've always loved winter, even with the cold." Yates asked, his arm supporting her as they navigated an icy patch of road, especially with the cold. "It makes coming home to a warm fire that much sweeter." Home. The word had slipped out without thought, but Nora realized with a start that it was true. The small house she shared with Yates had become home in a way no place had been since before her marriage to Thomas. As they reached their porch, Yates paused, looking up at the clear night sky. "First Christmas I haven't been on the trail in 8 years, he said thoughtfully. "Feels strange." "Good strange." Nora studied his profile in the moonlight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes. Over the past months, she had come to know this man's character, his principles, his quiet strength. And with that knowledge had come something deeper than friendship, something she was finally ready to acknowledge, at least to herself. "I'm glad you're not on the trail this year," she said softly. He turned to look at her, something shifting in his gaze. "So am I." They stood there in the winter stillness, snowflakes beginning to drift lazily from the sky, something unspoken yet powerful building between them. Then, with deliberate care, Yates reached out to brush a snowflake from Nora's cheek. His touch lingered, warm against her cold skin. "Nora," he said, his voice low, "I've been patient. I've tried to give you time, space. You have." Her heart raced, not with fear but with anticipation. "I don't want to push you, but I need you to know." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you. Have been since that first day, I think." The words hung in the air between them, crystalline and perfect as the snowflakes swirling around them. Nora felt a surge of emotion so powerful it momentarily robbed her of speech. "You don't have to say anything," Yates continued quickly. "I just wanted you to know where I stand, how I feel." Nora found her voice at last. "My heart's been broken," she whispered, echoing the fear that had haunted her for so long. Yates's eyes softened as he cupped her face gently between his hands. "Then let me fix it gently," he replied, his words a solemn vow. And as the snow fell silently around them, Yates Morgan lowered his head and kissed Nora Sullivan a kiss as tender as a promise, as healing as forgiveness, as hopeful as dawn after the darkest night. When they finally pulled apart, Nora's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy so profound it ached within her chest. "I think," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The smile that spread across Yates's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant, transformative. He pulled her close again, his arms strong and secure around her. "Then we'll fall together," he murmured against her hair, "and catch each other." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight sparkling off the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Nora woke early, a sense of anticipation filling her as it had when she was a child. But this excitement had nothing to do with presents, and everything to do with the man whose home she shared, whose heart she was learning to trust. She dressed carefully in a deep red dress she'd been saving for a special occasion, pinning her hair in a simple but elegant style. From her dresser drawer, she retrieved a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, her gift for Yates, selected with great care weeks earlier. In the kitchen, she found him already up, the coffee made and a small fire crackling in the stove. He turned at her entrance, his expression warming at the sight of her. "Merry Christmas," he said, crossing to her and taking her hands in his. "You look beautiful. Merry Christmas." She smiled up at him, still marveling at the ease she now felt in his presence, the rightness of being with him. "I have something for you," as I do for you." He led her to the sitting room where a small fir tree stood in the corner, decorated with simple ornaments and candles. Beneath it lay a package wrapped in blue paper. They sat together on the sofa, exchanging their gifts with shy smiles. Nora watched as Yates carefully unwrapped his present, revealing the silver pocket watch she'd chosen. "Open it," she urged. Inside the cover, she had engraved a simple message. "Time spent with you is time well spent." Yates traced the words with his finger, his expression solemn. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, you're welcome." Nora felt a flush of pleasure at his reaction. "I noticed your old one was unreliable. Now it's your turn." He handed her the blue package, watching intently as she unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. Nora opened it to find a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Yates," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. Open it," he echoed her earlier instruction. Inside the locket was a tiny painting, not a portrait, as was traditional, but a miniature landscape showing the creek and mountains behind Willow Creek. "So no matter where life takes you," Yates explained softly, "you'll always have a piece of this place with you." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. The gift was thoughtful beyond measure, acknowledging her past need to flee while offering hope for a more settled future. "Help me put it on," she asked, handing him the necklace and turning so he could fasten it around her neck. His fingers were gentle as they brushed her skin, lingering a moment longer than necessary. When she turned back to face him, his expression was one of such tenderness that Nora felt her heart might burst. "There's something else I want to give you," Yates said, taking her hands in his. "Something less tangible than a locket, but I hope more lasting." "What is it?" she asked, though something in his tone made her suspect what was coming. "A promise." He met her gaze steadily. "I know you've been hurt. I know trust doesn't come easily to you now. But I promise you this, Nora Sullivan, I will never betray that trust. I will stand beside you through whatever comes, good or bad, joy or sorrow." He shifted from the sofa to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "I'm not asking for marriage, not yet. That's a decision for when you're ready, if you're ever ready. But I am asking for your permission to love you, to care for you, to build a life with you." Nora felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "Yates Morgan," she said, her voice wavering but certain, "you've already fixed my broken heart more than I thought possible. Yes, yes to all of it." His answering smile was brilliant as he rose to sit beside her again, gathering her in his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise more effectively than any words could have. Later that day, they joined the town for the community Christmas dinner at the church. As they entered together, Nora on Yates's arm, she was acutely aware of the glances they received, but for the first time she found she didn't care. Let them look. Let them talk. What she and Yates shared was too precious, too real to be diminished by gossip. They were welcomed warmly by most misses Abernathy with a knowing smile, Sheriff Hollister with a hearty handshake, even Mrs. Jenkins with grudging approval. Only Victoria Hargrove maintained a cool distance, her sharp eyes noting the new locket at Nora's throat, the way Yates's hand rarely left the small of her back. "Quite the cozy arrangement you've made for yourselves," Victoria commented as she passed their table, her voice pitched low for their ears only. "Though I wonder how long it will last once spring comes and the bounties call again." Before Nora could respond, Yates spoke, his tone pleasant but firm. "Mrs. Hargrove, I've found that the greatest bounty of all is right here in Willow Creek. I don't intend to stray far from it again." Victoria's lips thinned, but she moved on without further comment. Nora glanced at Yates, touched by his declaration. "Did you mean that?" she asked quietly. "About not straying far, every word." He covered her hand with his. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. Sheriff Hollister has offered me a permanent position as his deputy. The pay's less than bounty hunting, but it's steady, and it means staying here with you." The implications of his words settled over Nora like a warm blanket. Yates was putting down roots for himself, yes, but also for her, for them. It was a commitment beyond anything she dared to hope for. "What about the excitement, the challenge?" she asked, remembering his stories of the trail. "I've had enough excitement to last a lifetime," he replied with a rueful smile. And as for challenge, well, keeping the peace in a growing mining town offers plenty of that. Besides, his voice softened. Building a life with you is the greatest adventure I can imagine. Nora's heart swelled with an emotion so profound it defied naming. This man, this good, honorable man had chosen her, had chosen a life with her, despite knowing her past, her fears, her scars. "I love you," she said simply, the words feeling right, feeling true in a way she'd never experienced before. The joy that lit Yates's face was answer enough, but he leaned close to whisper, "And I love you, Nora Sullivan, with all that I am." Spring arrived in Willow Creek with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The creek swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, its rushing waters a constant backdrop to the town's daily life. For Nora, the season brought changes both subtle and profound. She had been promoted to head librarian when Mrs. Abernathy decided to retire to Denver to be near her daughter. The position came with increased responsibilities, but also greater respect within the community. Slowly, steadily, she had earned her place in Willow Creek. Yates had transitioned fully to his role as deputy sheriff, his knowledge of outlaws and their methods proving invaluable to the town's law enforcement. He still occasionally tracked fugitives, but never ventured more than a day's ride from home from Nora. Their relationship had deepened over the winter months, each day bringing new discoveries, new layers of trust and understanding. They had maintained separate bedrooms, honoring propriety and Nora's need for gradual progress, but their hearts were as entwined as two could be. On a warm May evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Yates took Nora's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, leaning her head against his shoulder. He chuckled. "Perhaps. But necessary nonetheless." He shifted to face her more directly. "Nora, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. And mine," she said softly. "I know we agreed to take things slowly, to let you set the pace." His fingers traced gentle patterns on her palm. "And I've been content with that arrangement. But lately, I've been wondering if perhaps it's time for something more official." Nora's heart quickened. "Official?" From his pocket, Yates withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Nora Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had suspected this was coming, the reality of the moment, the ring, the question, the love shining in Yates's eyes overwhelmed Nora. For a brief, terrible instant, Thomas's face flashed in her memory, his betrayal, his threats, the fear that had driven her for so long. But as quickly as it appeared, the shadow vanished, chased away by the warmth of Yates's steady presence, his unwavering devotion. This was different. He was different, and she was different too, stronger, wiser, more capable of recognizing true love when it was offered. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Yates Morgan, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, attended by most of the town. Nora wore a new dress of pale blue silk with Mrs. Abernathy's pearl comb in her hair and Yates's locket around her neck. Yates was resplendent in a new black suit, his silver-touched hair neatly combed, his face shaven clean for the occasion. As they spoke their vows, Nora felt the last of her old fears dissolve. The woman who had arrived in Willow Creek nearly a year ago, haunted, wary, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found not just safety but belonging, not just refuge but home. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, beaming at the couple. "You may kiss your bride." Yates's kiss was gentle yet fervent, a perfect reflection of the man himself. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Nora caught sight of Mrs. Abernathy wiping away a tear, Sheriff Hollister nodding in approval, even Victoria Hargrove offering a grudging smile. The celebration afterward was festive music and dancing in the town square, food and drink flowing freely as the community marked the union of two of its own. As evening fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the revelry. Happy, Mrs. Morgan? Yates asked as they swayed together to a slow melody played by the town's small band. Nora smiled at the new name, her new identity, freely chosen this time. Happier than I ever thought possible, she replied, her arms around his neck, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. No regrets, no second thoughts. She looked up at him, this man who had patiently helped her rebuild her capacity for trust, for love. None, she said firmly. My heart is whole again, thanks to you. Yates's arms tightened around her. And mine is fuller than I ever dreamed it could be, thanks to you. Later that night, in the privacy of what was now their shared bedroom, Nora and Yates sealed their vows in the most intimate way possible with tender touches, whispered endearments, and the joining of bodies that had already joined their hearts. As Nora drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the gunshot that had first thrown her into Yates's path to the vows they had exchanged, each step, even the painful ones, had been necessary, leading her home. What are you thinking? Yates murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. That sometimes, she replied, nestling closer to him, broken things, when mended with care, become stronger at the broken places. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. And more beautiful for having been broken and mended. Yes, Nora agreed, closing her eyes, secure in his embrace. More beautiful indeed. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Willow Creek continued to grow as the mines prospered, bringing new residents and new opportunities. Yates was eventually appointed sheriff when Hollister retired, a position that suited his natural authority and sense of justice. Nora expanded the library, creating a school program that brought literature and learning to the town's growing population of children. In their third year of marriage, they welcomed a daughter, Catherine Abigail Morgan, named for both their mothers. She was a bright, curious child with Yates's blue eyes and Nora's auburn hair, the center of their world from the moment she drew her first breath. 2 years later, a son joined their family, James Thomas Morgan. The middle name had been Nora's choice, a final act of reclamation that stripped her first husband's name of its power over her. This Thomas would grow up with integrity and compassion, healing the wounds left by his namesake. Through it all, the sleepless nights with infants, the busy days balancing work and family, the occasional crises that demanded Sheriff Morgan's attention, Nora and Yates remained steadfast in their devotion to each other. The deep friendship that had first drawn them together evolved into a partnership of equals, each supporting the other's dreams and needs. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the home they had expanded to accommodate their growing family, Yates presented Nora with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," he urged. Inside, on the first page, he had written, "For Nora, who taught me that the bravest act is to love again after heartbreak. These are the stories of our life together, a life I treasure more with each passing day." Tears filled Nora's eyes as she turned the pages, finding entries in Yates's neat handwriting chronicling their journey, their first meeting during the shootout, their dinner at the hotel, the night he had first kissed her in the snow, their wedding day, the births of their children, and countless smaller moments that had shaped their life together. "You've been keeping this all along?" she asked, deeply moved by the gesture. "Since the day I knew I loved you." He took her hand, the same gentle touch that had first begun to heal her broken heart. "I wanted to make sure, if you ever doubted again, you'd have proof of how completely you are loved." Nora set the journal aside and moved into his arms. At 41, Yates was more handsome than ever to her eyes, the silver now prominent at his temples, the lines around his eyes speaking of a life of laughter and joy rather than hardship. "I don't doubt," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "Not anymore." From inside the house came the sound of their children's laughter, Catherine teaching James a new game, their voices bright with the security of knowing they were cherished. "We've built something beautiful here," Yates observed, his arm around Nora as they listened to their children. "Something lasting." "Yes," Nora agreed, thinking of the frightened woman she had once been, always looking over her shoulder, always ready to run. And we're still building every day. As the sun set behind the mountains that had become so dear to her, Nora Morgan reflected on the strange, wonderful path that had led her to this life. A chance encounter during a moment of danger. A wounded heart offered healing by careful hands. A leap of faith rewarded beyond all expectation. "I love you, Yates Morgan," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she'd spoken them, "for fixing my heart so gently." "And I love you, Nora Morgan," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple, "for trusting me enough to let me try." Together they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced the past side by side, heart to heart. Their once broken pieces now merged into something stronger, more beautiful, and utterly unbreakable.